Hey guys, tonight we're exploring why you'd freeze in Viking winters, why the cold would slip through your clothes, through your bones, and settle somewhere deep inside your ribs. We're going to sit by the fire together and imagine life in a Scandinavian longhouse, where the smoke never really leaves, where the wind scratches at the walls, and where winter lasts so long you forget what green looks like. You'll learn what it smelled like inside those timber halls, how families survived when food ran low, and how the sagas whispered nightmares into the dark. So settle in, pull the blanket a little tighter. Imagine the soft crackle of a fireplace beside us, because tonight we're traveling north into the long winter, and we're not coming back until spring first. Let's step into a longhouse somewhere in what is now Norway. Around the year 900, the snow outside is piled high against the wooden walls. The roof is heavy with it, like a tired old animal carrying too much weight. The door creaks open and you duck your head to step inside, and the first thing you notice is not the warmth. It's the smell: smoke, damp wool, old sweat, animal fur, sour milk, and something else. Something earthy and stale. Because in winter the windows are shuttered, the smoke hole barely lets the air move, and 30 or 40 people are breathing the same thick atmosphere over and over again. The fire runs down the center of the hall, a long strip of glowing embers, stones placed carefully along its edges. But there is no chimney in the modern sense. The smoke lazily pools against the rafters and then slowly seeps out through a hole in the roof. If the wind is kind, but if the wind changes, the smoke sinks back down and your eyes burn, and you cough quietly into your sleeve, trying not to complain, because everyone else is coughing too. And this is just how winter smells. You sit on a wooden bench, lined with straw and covered in rough wool. The fabric scratches your skin. It never fully dries. Even near the fire, your boots are damp from snow that melted and then soaked through, and now your toes tingle in that uncomfortable way that warns you they might not stay warm for long, because outside the temperature can fall far below freezing, especially across Scandinavia, where the sun barely climbs above the horizon in midwinter, where daylight feels like a rumor rather than a fact. Now imagine that you are not a visiting observer, but a farmer. You spent the brief summer cutting hay, drying fish, salting meat, gathering what you could before the world turned white, because winter is not a surprise here. It is an annual test, and the question is always the same. Did you store enough food? Defines everything in good years. You have smoked lamb hanging from the beams, dried cods stacked carefully in bundles, barrels of fermented fish, coarse bread made from barley, maybe a little butter sealed in a wooden tub. But in a bad year, those stores shrink faster than you expected. A storm ruined the hay, a disease took some sheep, the fishing boats came back light, and now every bowl of porridge is measured with care. Every slice of meat is thinner than you would like. You can almost hear the wind outside now, rattling the wooden planks, slipping through tiny gaps. Because longhouses are sturdy, but not sealed tight. They are built from timber and turf, sometimes with sod layered thick along the walls for insulation. But the cold always finds a way. It sneaks in around the door, through the roof, beneath the benches. It wraps itself around your ankles first, then climbs slowly upward. At night, families sleep along the walls, close together, sharing warmth like clustered animals. Children pressed against parents, grandparents, wrapped in furs, everyone listening to the crackle of the fire and the low murmur of voices. And when the fire burns low, someone has to rise, half asleep, and feed it more wood. Because if the flames die completely, the cold moves in quickly, like an uninvited guest who never planned to leave. But even with the fire burning, the warmth is uneven. Your face might feel hot while your back remains chilled. Your hands thaw while your feet stay numb, and the smoke lingers, constantly settling into your hair, your clothes, your bedding, so that even in spring, when the doors finally open wide, everything still smells faintly of winter. Let's talk about light, because winter light in the north is a fragile thing. In places like Iceland, which was settled by Norse families during this era, the days grow so short that work must be done quickly. And then darkness stretches on for long hours. Oil lamps burn with a soft, flickering glow, fueled by animal fat. They give off a smell that is both comforting and slightly rancid, a reminder that every resource is precious. In that darkness, stories become important. The sagas are told and retold, tales of heroes and feuds, of voyages and vengeance, of gods like Odin who sacrificed for wisdom, and Thor who wielded his hammer against giants. The stories fill the long hours. They distract from the cold, but they also carry a certain heaviness, because many of them end in blood, or betrayal, or the looming shadow of Ragnarok, the final winter, the end of everything. Imagine listening to those tales while the wind howls outside, while snow taps against the roof, while you know that beyond these walls lies a frozen landscape where a wrong step could mean death. The line between story and reality feels thin, because winter itself already feels like a slow apocalypse. Now let's step outside for a moment. Just briefly wrap a fur cloak around your shoulders, open the heavy door, and feel the shock of cold air hit. Your lungs, it steals your breath instantly. The snow crunches underfoot hard and dry. The sky is pale, almost colorless, and the sun hangs low, barely warming anything. Livestock are kept as close as possible sometimes, even in attached shelters, their breath visible in the air. Their bodies another source of warmth, and also another source of smell, because animals and humans live in close quarters for months. The latrine is outside, of course, a short walk away, and in deep winter that short walk feels very long. You hurry, boots slipping slightly, fingers stiff, hoping no icy wind catches your cloak and sends a blast of snow down your neck. And when you return inside, you stamp your feet, brush snow from your shoulders, and feel that strange relief of re-entering the smoky warmth, even if it stings your eyes. Winter is not only cold, it is quiet. Fields lie buried beneath snow, ships are pulled onto shore and left idle. Trade slows, travel becomes dangerous, and so the world shrinks to the size of the longhouse, to the faces you see every day, to the same voices, the same routines, the same worries, over and worries there are. Because famine is never far from thought. If supplies run out before spring, there are few options. Some communities may slaughter breeding animals, sacrificing the future for the present. Others may ration so strictly that hunger becomes a constant companion, a dull ache that never quite fades. You go to sleep hungry, you wake up hungry, you work through the day hungry, and you tell yourself that spring will come, that it always does, even if it feels impossibly distant. There are winters recorded in later sagas, where ice filled the future, where storms destroyed boats, where entire households weakened from lack of food. And though we cannot name every individual who suffered, we can imagine the slow wearing down of strength, the way tempers shorten when stomachs are empty, the way small disputes can flare into lasting feuds when everyone is already strained. Inside the longhouse, space is shared. Privacy barely exists. Conversations are overheard. Arguments cannot be escaped. And yet there is also closeness, a kind of forced intimacy. Because survival depends on cooperation, someone must tend the fire, someone must repair tools, someone must watch the animals, someone must prepare the simple meals. And each task, though small, matters deeply. In winter, hands become rough from constant work, splitting wood, carrying water from a partially frozen stream, mending clothing by lamplight, and the water itself is a challenge. Ice forms thickly, and breaking it each morning is a chore that sends a shock up your arms. You carry the heavy bucket back carefully, knowing that spilling it would mean another freezing trip. Sleep comes slowly sometimes, because the wind does not stop. It hums and moans around the structure, occasionally shaking it. And in the dark, your mind drifts to thoughts of what lies beyond. Wolves, perhaps, or spirits from the old stories, because when the world outside is hidden under snow, imagination fills the gaps. And so you lie there wrapped in fur that smells faintly of smoke and animal, listening to breathing all around you, feeling the uneven warmth of the fading fire, knowing that tomorrow will be much like today, cold, smoky, slow, careful. And you begin to understand that surviving a Viking winter is not about one dramatic moment. It is about endurance, about small acts repeated daily, about patience that stretches as long as the night. The cold is not loud. It does not shout. It simply persists. It waits. It presses gently but constantly against wood and wool and skin. And if you are careless, if you neglect the fire, if you misjudge your supplies, if you underestimate the season, it will claim its quiet victory. So as we sit here by our imaginary fireplace, in comfort that those northern families could hardly imagine, let's keep walking through their winter slowly. Let's feel the smoke in our eyes, the hunger in our stomach, the weight of stories in the dark, because we've only just stepped inside the longhouse, and there is so much more winter ahead of us. The cold does not care that you are tired. It arrives before dawn, sliding through the cracks in the timber, brushing across your face while the fire has burned low. And you wake not because you are rested, but because your nose feels like ice, your breath, visible in the dim light, curling upward toward the smoky rafters. And for a few quiet seconds you wonder if the embers have died completely, because if they have, the entire hall will feel it soon. Someone shifts beside you, wool rustling, a low cough breaking the silence, and across the longhouse a figure rises slowly, wrapping a fur cloak tighter around their shoulders, stepping carefully over sleeping bodies, carrying a small bundle of kindling toward the central hearth. The ash is gray and soft, but when stirred gently a faint red glow answers back a promise that the fire is not gone, yet just waiting. There is relief in that glow. Small but real, because relighting a dead hearth in deep winter is more than inconvenience. Edie's Donger flint must be struck, sparks coaxed into tinder, precious time lost, while cold creeps further into fingers and toes. So when the embers catch and a thin flame licks upward, you feel warmth return not only to the hall, but to your thoughts. Outside, beyond the thick turf walls, snow drifts against the structure in uneven waves, and in places like Sweden the wind sweeps across open land without mercy, gathering speed over frozen lakes and empty fields. It finds every weakness in construction, every slight gap where wood meets wood, and presses there patiently, hour after hour, as if testing resolve. You sit up slowly, hoint stiff, and pull on clothing that never truly dries. Linen underlayers that feel cold against the skin at first touch, wool tunics heavy with the faint scent of smoke, trousers tucked into boots lined with fur. And even with all of this, the chill lingers, because layers help, but they do not conquer winter. They only bargain with it. Breakfast is simple, often the same as yesterday and the day before, a thin porridge of barley stirred in an iron pot suspended above the fire. Steam rising gently, carrying a faint, nutty scent, bowls passed hand to hand. Each portion measured without discussion, because everyone knows how much remains in storage, and everyone understands the unspoken rule. Do not take more than your share. Sometimes there is dried fish softened in water, sometimes a scrap of smoked meat shaved thinly, and on rare mornings, a bit of butter melts into the porridge, turning it briefly rich and golden, a small luxury that feels almost festive. But such mornings are not common in the long stretch between midwinter and the first thaw. Food stores are kept carefully along the walls. Barrels sealed with wooden lids, sacks of grain tied tightly, smoked cuts of lamb hanging from rafters, where Smode continues to preserve them. And yet even preserved meat changes over time. The texture grows tougher, the flavor sharper, and there is always the quiet worry of spoilage of mold, creeping unseen of rodents, slipping in through some unnoticed opening. Cats sometimes share the longhouse for this reason. Small hunters moving silently along the edges of the room, eyes reflecting firelight, keeping watch over grain supplies. Their presence tolerated, even appreciated. Because in winter, every crumb matters. You might imagine that Vikings were fearless warriors at all times. But winter turns even the strongest fighter into a cautious planner. Axes are sharpened not for battle, but for splitting wood. Shields lean unused against walls. Ships rest upside down on shorelines far away, while here in the hall the daily battle is against cold and scarcity. In settlements across Denmark and neighboring regions, communities learned to read winter like a slow-moving story. Early snow meant one thing, late storms meant another, the thickness of ice on rivers, the behavior of livestock, even the way wind shifted from the sea, all were signs to be watched carefully, because missing a sign could mean hunger later. And hunger has a way of changing people at first. It is mild, a slight emptiness between meals. Then it becomes sharper, more insistent. You find yourself thinking about food, constantly remembering the taste of fresh bread from autumn, the richness of summer milk, the sweetness of berries now buried beneath snow. And memory can be both comfort and torment. There are winters mentioned in the sagas of Iceland, where sea ice blocked fishing routes, where storms tore apart storage sheds, where families had to decide which animals to slaughter and which to try to keep alive until spring, and those choices were not simple. A cow might provide immediate meat, but also future milk. A sheep might feed you now but leave you with less wool next year. Every decision weighed present survival against future stability. Inside the longhouse, tasks continue. Despite the cold, wool must be spun into thread looms. Creaked softly as fabric is woven, the repetitive motion, steady and almost hypnotic fingers, moving automatically while mind's drift tools are repaired. Wooden handles replaced, metal fittings tightened. Because when spring arrives, work will resume at full speed, and preparation cannot wait until then. Children learn quietly by watching small hands, mimicking larger ones, learning how to twist fibers, how to carve wood carefully without splitting it, how to listen when elders speak of past winters. Because memory is a kind of inheritance. Hear knowledge passed down not in books, but in stories, told by firelight. And those stories grow darker as night deepens, because winter nights are long, especially in the far north where daylight fades quickly. And once the simple chores are done, once the bowls are scraped clean and set aside, once the animals are checked and the door barred against wind, left buttock, the sagas speak of feud and fate, of honor tested, of journeys across icy seas, but they also whisper of restless dead who guard their burial mounds, and of spirits that wander in snowstorms. And while you might smile at such tales in summer and winter, they feel closer, more possible, because the world outside, the longhouse, is silent and white and unknowable. When the wind rises at night and rattles the roof beams, when snow slides suddenly from one side of the structure with a heavy thud, it is easy for imagination to take hold, for someone to glance toward the door and wonder briefly what stands beyond it. Because winter reduces the visible world to a narrow circle of firelight, and everything beyond that circle feels distant and uncertain. Even illness spreads more easily in these months. Coughs linger in smoky air. Fevers pass from one sleeping space to another. And without modern medicine, recovery depends on rest herbs, stored from summer and simple endurance. A minor sickness in autumn might become serious by midwinter, when bodies are already weakened by cold and limited. Diet water too becomes complicated. Wells can freeze, streams form thick ice, and someone must venture out daily to break through and haul back enough for cooking and washing. The task is exhausting, arms aching from striking ice, breath sharpen lungs. And there is always the risk of slipping, of soaking clothing in freezing water far from the warmth of the hearth. You begin to understand that winter survival is not heroic in a dramatic sense. It is repetitive, patient, slow. The same actions performed every day: feed the fire ration, the food, mend the clothing, check the animals, tell the stories, sleep close together, wake and do it again. And yet within that repetition there is resilience. Because communities that endured these seasons did so year after year, generation after generation, building longhouses designed to hold heat, layering turf thickly along walls, angling roofs to shed snow, choosing settlement sites with care, near water but not too exposed, close to resources yet sheltered from the harshest winds. Still, even the best planning cannot remove the bite of midwinter entirely. There are nights when the cold feels sharper than usual, when frost forms along the inside edges of wooden walls, when breath crystallizes faintly in the air before fading, and you pull your cloak tighter and shift closer to those beside you, sharing warmth without speaking. If you listen closely now in our quiet telling, you can almost hear the steady breathing of a hall at rest. The low crackle of embers, the soft murmur of someone finishing a story about a voyage long ago, the wind outside easing for a moment, and in that pause there is something almost peaceful. Because winter, for all its hardship, also brings stillness. The world beyond the snow is paused. Fields sleep beneath white blankets. Forests stand silent under frost. Rivers move slowly beneath ice, and within the longhouse life contracts into a small glowing center of light and warmth. Fragile but persistent, you might not survive a Viking winter easily, not without preparation, not without learning these rhythms. But as you sit here, imagining it, you can sense how survival was woven into daily habit, into shared responsibility, into stories that reminded people that even the longest winter eventually loosens its grip. And yet, we are only halfway through the season, the deepest cold still weighing the stores slightly lower than you would like. The nights still stretching long and dark ahead of you and outside. Beyond the circle of firelight, the snow continues to fall, softly, steadily, covering tracks, covering fields, covering the world in white. By the time midwinter settles in fully, You stop expecting warmth to win. You measure comfort in small victories. A stronger flame, a thicker stew, a day when the wind does not scream across the roof. And somewhere in the far north of Norway, the sun barely lifts itself above the horizon before slipping away again, leaving behind a pale blue twilight that feels almost permanent. This is the season when time stretches, when days blur together, and you begin to understand why the Old Norse calendar marked this period with gatherings like what we now call Yule, a midwinter festival, meant to break the darkness with light feasting and ritual. Because without something to look forward to, the cold would feel endless inside the longhouse. Preparations for such a feast begin carefully, even cautiously, because celebrating requires using precious stores. A pig might be slaughtered, ale brought out from barrels saved since autumn. And for one brief stretch of nights, the hall becomes louder, brighter, warmer, laughter rising towards smoked dog rafters. But beneath the celebration is calculation. How much can we spare? How much must remain? Until spring. The fire during these gatherings burns higher than usual, sparks drifting upward in a slow dance, shadows leaping along carved wooden pillars, and the smell shifts. Slightly roasted meat, mixing with the constant undertone of smoke and wool. For a moment, you almost forget the cold beyond the walls. Stories grow grander during these nights. Sagas recited with emphasis, ancestors praised, heroes remembered, and the names of gods spoken with reverence. Odin the wise wanderer, Thor the thunderer, and whispers of Fimbulwinter, the terrible winter said to come before the end of the world, a winter without summers between. 3 long years of cold that would test even the strongest. As the tale of Fimbulwinter is told, you might notice a few listeners glance toward the door. Because in truth, every harsh season feels like a small rehearsal for that mythic catastrophe when snow falls heavier than expected, when animals weaken, when grain runs lower than planned. It is easy to imagine that this could be the winter that does not end. After the feast, quiet returns gradually. Leftovers carefully preserved, bones boiled for broth, nothing wasted, because indulgence cannot last. And by late January or early February, the deepest cold often settles in, ice thick along fjords, forests creaking softly. As trees contract in freezing air, travel during this period becomes both easier and more dangerous. Snow and ice create smooth paths across land, and frozen water sleds glide where boats once sailed, but a misjudged patch of thin ice can swallow a traveler instantly. And in regions like Sweden, frozen lakes become highways, tempting shortcuts that demand careful knowledge of thickness and flow beneath the surface inside. The whole supplies are checked again and again, barrels opened briefly to assess levels, grain weighed by feel rather than scale, and if stores appear thin, rations shrink, subtly, bowls filled, just a little less, slices cut, slightly narrower, no announcement made, but everyone notices. Hunger sharpens the senses in strange ways. The smell of cooking seems stronger, the sound of chewing more pronounced. The sight of someone licking a spoon almost mesmerizing, and patience becomes a skill, practiced daily. You tell yourself that spring grass will grow again, that lambs will be born, that fish will return to open waters. The animals themselves endure alongside you. Cattle, sheltered in byres, attached to the longhouse, their body heat rising gently through shared walls. Sheep huddled close. Chickens kept alive only if feed allows, and caring for them requires daily effort. Hay carried from diminishing stacks, water brought carefully, stalls cleaned, despite numb fingers, because if livestock die, the loss echoes far beyond winter. Smoke remains constant, drifting, clinging, settling into every surface, and over months it darkens the interior wood, creating a sheen of soot that both preserves and stains. Your hair carries it. Your skin carries it. And when you finally step outside for fresh air, the cold feels cleaner somehow, even as it bites harder. Illness during this late winter stretch can be cruel, a simple cough echoing too loudly. In the hall, a fever that refuses to break, and though herbal remedies exist, dried leaves and roots, save from summer, their power is limited. Recovery depends largely on strength already stored in the body. And by this point, strength may be waning. You begin to sleep more lightly, perhaps from hunger, perhaps from the constant awareness of responsibility. If the fire dims too much, if a storm rises, suddenly, if an animal breaks loose, someone must respond quickly. Winter does not allow deep carelessness. There are moments, though brief and quiet, when beauty intrudes, frost patterns forming delicate shapes along the inside of shutters, moonlight reflecting off snow so brightly that the landscape glows. And if you step outside at night, wrapped tightly in fur, you might see the northern lights ripple across the sky, green and pale, silent and vast, and for a few seconds the cold feels less hostile, more like a stage for something grand and distant. Back inside, daily rhythm resumes, weaving, mending, carving, storytelling. The repetition almost meditative. Hands moving in practiced patterns, minds drifting gently between memory and anticipation. And in these long hours bonds deepen, disputes settled quietly, alliances strengthened, because shared hardship has a way of binding people tightly together, yet tension never disappears entirely. Cramped space breeds irritation, minor habits become magnified. Someone's snoring, someone's careless use of extra firewood, someone lingering too long over the ale barrel, and managing these small frictions requires diplomacy, often guided by the head of household, whose authority rests partly on fairness in distributing scarce resources. The structure of the longhouse itself reveals this hierarchy. High seat at one end, reserved for the leader, benches arranged along walls, guests placed according to status, and in winter these social arrangements remain visible even in sleep, positions maintained out of respect and tradition, reinforcing order when external world feels chaotic and frozen. As weeks pass, subtle signs of change begin to appear, though you must look closely. Daylight lingers a fraction longer each afternoon. Snow softens slightly at edges during rare sunny hours. Icicles drip faintly before refreezing at night. And these tiny shifts become topics of conversation. Cautious optimism woven into routine. But late winter can also bring its harshest storms: heavy snow, collapsing weaker roofs, winds driving drifts high against doors, forcing households to dig themselves out repeatedly. And when such storms strike settlements, in places like Iceland, the isolation feels complete. No travel possible, no help expected, only endurance within wooden walls. You may lie awake during one of these storms, listening to wind batter the structure, wondering if beams will hold, if turf will stay packed tight, and each loud gust sends a ripple of unease through those half asleep around you. Because while longhouses are sturdy, they are not invincible. And still morning comes, storm or not. Fire must be fed, animals tended, water, hauled porridge, stirred life, continuing in steady defiance of cold, and you realize that survival here is less about strength and more about rhythm. About refusing to let routine break even when weather rages. The sagas told at night begin to shift in tone as well. From tales of doom to stories of clever survival, of ancestors who endured worse winters and emerged stronger, reinforcing the belief that this season too will pass. That hardship is a chapter, not the entire book. So you sit once more by the central hearth, hands extended toward modest warmth, smoke curling upward, listening to wind soften outside. And you feel both weariness and resilience woven together. Because you have made it through the darkest stretch, though the cold still lingers. Spring is not here yet, but it is no longer unimaginable, and that small change in imagination matters deeply. It steadies your thoughts, slows your fears, and lets you rest a little more easily against the rough wool at your back. The winter has not defeated you. Not yet, but it has shaped you, etched lines of patience into your days, taught you to value every ember, every crumb, every shared story in the smoky glow of the longhouse. And as the fire settles into a steady burn once again, you close your eyes briefly, breathing in warmth and ash, knowing there are still weeks to endure, still challenges to face before the thaw. By late winter, the cold feels older, heavier somehow, as if it has settled permanently into the beams of the longhouse, into your clothes, into your thoughts. And even in coastal settlements along Denmark, where winters are milder than farther north, the damp chill creeps in from the sea, seeping through wool and wood alike. This is the stretch when supplies are at their thinnest, when barrels echo slightly, when tapped, when sacks of grain sag lower than anyone would prefer, and meals become simpler still, porridge stretched with extra water, broth flavored more by memory than by meat. You begin to measure time, not in days, but in remaining portions, counting silently how many bowls of barley are left, how many smoked fish, still hang from rafters. How many handfuls of dried peas can be spared before true worry sets in, and this quiet arithmetic hums constantly beneath conversation. The longhouse itself shows signs of long use through the season. Straw bedding flattened and replaced in patches, walls darkened further by soot, tools worn, smooth by repeated handling, and yet everything continues to function because maintenance never truly stops. Even in the coldest months, clothing requires constant attention. Woolen cloaks patched carefully where sparks from the hearth have burned small holes. Leather boots resoled with scraps saved from autumn mittens reneat from unraveled thread, and these repairs are done patiently by lamplight fingers, stiff but determined, because a single tear left unattended could mean frostbitten skin later. Frostbite is not dramatic at first. It begins as a tingling at fingertips or toes after a brief task outside, perhaps carrying water or chopping wood. But if ignored, it deepens. Skin palling, sensation fading, and without modern understanding of treatment. Prevention is the only true defense. Keep moving, keep covered. Return to warmth quickly. Wood for the fire must also be rationed carefully, stacks gathered in autumn. Now noticeably smaller, each log chosen thoughtfully before being placed on the embers stew. Many at once wastes fuel to few, lets the cold creep back in, and so tending the hearth becomes almost an art, a balance between flame and scarcity. Sometimes arguments flare over this balance. A younger member of the household tossing on extra wood in a moment of impatience, an elder scolding gently but firmly, reminding everyone that winter is not yet finished, that generosity toward the fire now may mean shivering later. Outside snow begins to crust over during rare daytime thaws, forming a brittle surface that crunches sharply underfoot, and in regions of Norway where mountains loom nearby, avalanches pose quiet threats, distant rumbles echoing faintly, a reminder that winter's dangers are not confined to hunger. A lone livestock show strained too, ribs more visible beneath hide, milk production nearly stopped, movements slower, and caring for them requires both compassion and practicality. Because if an animal weakens beyond recovery, a decision must be made: preserve the meat now, or risk losing it entirely. Such decisions weigh heavily on a household leader, especially in societies influenced by assemblies like the Althing in Iceland, where reputation and responsibility intertwine, fairness within the household reflecting honor in the wider community even if winter limits travel and gatherings. Inside the hall, mental strain can grow alongside physical fatigue, long hours in dim light encouraging introspection, sometimes worry, and the sagas told at night take on new layers, listeners paying closer attention to themes of endurance, betrayal, reconciliation. Because these stories mirror their own constrained lives, one tale might recount a hero surviving exile in frozen lands. Another might describe a feud resolved only after years of hardship, and as these narratives unfold, you notice how often winter serves as backdrop, not merely weather, but a character itself, shaping fate, testing resolve. Children grow restless during this period, energy bottled up by confinement, small games played along benches, carved wooden figures, moved across rough tabletops, laughter quickly hushed if it becomes too loud because noise in tight quarters can irritate. Those already worn thin by hunger and cold, even sleep patterns shift, some rising earlier to conserve oil for lamps, others lingering under furs slightly longer on especially dark mornings. And dreams become vivid, perhaps fueled by heavy stories and light meals, visions of green fields, open water, or sometimes darker images of endless snow in coastal settlements. Fishermen watch the sea carefully for signs of change, scanning ice edges for openings, hoping for a chance to cast nets again, because fresh fish would transform meals instantly, adding protein and morale alike, but venturing too early risks being trapped by shifting ice. Across Sweden, inland farmers inspect their stores one more time, calculating whether they can spare seed grain for immediate consumption or must guard it fiercely for planting, and the temptation to eat what should be sown can be strong when bellies ache persistently. This tension between present need and future survival defines late winter more than any storm. It is a quiet, internal battle, repeated daily, and those who choose wisely secure not just their own lives, but the continuity of the household into another year. Occasionally a traveler arrives, bundled heavily, face reddened by wind, bringing news from neighboring settlements, tales of harsher conditions elsewhere, or perhaps slightly better fortune. And such visits break monotony, offering perspective, reminding you that your struggle is shared across valleys and fjords. The arrival of news might also revive memories of summer voyages of ships slicing through open water of trade and exploration. But for now, those memories feel distant, like scenes from another life, because winter reduces ambition to survival. As daylight inches longer, subtle shifts in mood begin to surface. Conversations include cautious references to spring tasks, repairing fences, preparing fields, planning fishing expeditions, and these discussions carry a tone of restrained hope, as if speaking too boldly might offend the lingering cold. The first true signs of thaw are small but unmistakable. Droplets falling steadily from icicles during midday sun, patches of darker earth emerging along southern walls, birds returning cautiously, their calls sharp and almost startling after months of muted landscape. Yet winter does not surrender. Isola's sudden storms still sweep through, covering early melts with fresh snow, reminding everyone not to grow careless, and so vigilance continues. Fires tended, carefully rations measured precisely, clothing layered thickly whenever stepping outside. Inside the longhouse, anticipation mingles with exhaustion. The season nearly endured but not yet complete, and you feel the weight of months lived in close quarters. The smoky air, the shared meals, the constant awareness of scarcity. There is pride too, quiet and unspoken, in having lasted this long, in having maintained order and cooperation despite strain. Because surviving a Viking winter is a communal achievement, not an individual triumph. As you sit once more by the hearth, embers glowing steadily, you reflect on how the hall itself has become a world, its wooden walls marking the boundary between safety and frozen uncertainty. Its fire the heart that must never fail. Outside, snow begins to recede slowly from the roof, sliding down in soft thuds, revealing darker patches of timber beneath, and with each slide you sense that the grip of winter is loosening, though not yet gone. You close your eyes briefly, listening to the softer wind, the faint drip of melting ice, the murmur of quiet conversation around you, and you realize that while you may have doubted your ability to endure such a season, you have adapted, learned its rhythms, respected its dangers. But before spring fully arrives, there is one final stretch to cross, one more test of patience and planning. Because the most deceptive period of all is the edge between winter and thaw, when hope rises quickly, but resources are at their lowest, and mistakes can still prove costly. This last stretch of winter is the strangest of all, because the light is returning. You can see it clearly now. The sun, lingering longer over the horizon in Norway and across the wider lands of Scandinavia. But the cold has not truly left. It clings stubbornly to the ground, to the shaded sides of buildings, to the inside corners of the longhouse, where frost still forms overnight. You wake one morning and notice something different. The air feels slightly softer, not warm exactly, but less sharp, less biting in your lungs. And when the door opens briefly, you catch the scent of damp earth beneath the snow, faint but unmistakable. And that smell alone almost feels like food, like promisey. Inside the hole, supplies are now at their lowest point. Barrels, nearly scraped clean grain, measured carefully down to the final handfuls. Dried fish, reduced to a few hard strips hanging from blackened beams and meals, have become almost ritual in their simplicity. Thin porridge-watered broth, perhaps, a scrap of preserved meat shared among many. Hunger at this stage is no longer a surprise. It is a steady companion, quieter than before, but deeper settled into the body, movements slower, patience thinner. And yet there is also relief in knowing that the worst cold has likely passed, that each day brings a little more. Light the animals' scents, change to restless in their shelters, shifting more frequently, noses lifting. To sniff the air when doors open, and tending them becomes a balance between conserving, dwindling hay, and trusting that grazing will soon be possible, though not quite yet. This period can be dangerous, precisely because hope grows strong. People may be tempted to venture farther from settlement, to check distant traps, or inspect fields too early. But patches of ice still hide beneath softening snow. Streams swell unpredictably with meltwater, and one careless step can still lead to injury far from help. In regions like Iceland, thaw often arrives unevenly, coastal edges clearing, while inland valleys remain locked in frost. And that unevenness demands caution, patience learned through generations. Inside the longhouse, cleaning begins slowly, bedding carried out on rare dry days, to air in weak sunlight. Soot brushed lightly from certain surfaces, tools reorganized in preparation for spring tasks, and these small acts of renewal lift spirits, even if bellies remain half full. The sagas told at night begin to change tone once more. Stories of survival completed, of voyages beginning with the first open water, of settlements founded after long winters endured, and even the darker myths feel less oppressive now, because outside the wind no longer howls with the same fury. You might hear mention again of Ragnarok, the doom of gods and men, but now it sounds distant, almost symbolic. A reminder that even destruction in myth is followed by renewal, by a world rising fresh from the sea, green and fertile once more. The first true sign of spring can be as simple as dripping, steady, rhythmic dripping from the roof, water carving small channels through packed snow, and you find yourself listening to that sound with quiet gratitude, because each drop means warmth somewhere. Children are often the first to venture outside for longer stretches, boots splashing through slush, laughter echoing as they discover patches of exposed grass and their energy feels. Contagious adults, following more cautiously but with similar relief. Fishing boats are inspected carefully, holes scraped of accumulated grime, ropes checked for weakness, nets untangled and repaired by hands, eager for work beyond the walls. And when the first boat pushes into open water again, it carries more than fishermen. It carries the weight of an entire winter's endurance. Fields are surveyed next, snow lingering in shadows, but retreating steadily from open ground, and the soil beneath is dark and heavy ready. Eventually, for seed, though patience is still required, planting too early could ruin precious grain. The final stores are rationed to last, just until fresh food becomes reliable again. Perhaps a thin stew, stretched with the first early greens, gathered cautiously from sheltered spots. Perhaps fish caught in newly thawed streams, and the taste of something fresh, even slightly bitter spring shoots, feels almost luxurious after months of preserved fare. Inside the longhouse, the air begins to clear more often, doors propped open during daylight hours to let smoke drift out more freely, sunlight penetrating deeper into the interior, revealing details. Long hidden in shadow-carved beams, worn benches' faces, lined by winter but brightened by light. You realize then how much the darkness shaped everything, how the smoky dimness compressed thought and feeling, and how light expands it again, making space feel larger, time feel quicker. There is talk of repairs needed before next winter, improvements to roofing, thicker turf, along walls, better storage solutions for grain, because every harsh season leaves lessons behind, and those lessons are not forgotten. They are folded into planning for the year ahead in assemblies held later, perhaps at gatherings inspired by institutions like the Thing. Communities will exchange stories of how each household fared, whose stores lasted longest, whose animals survived best, whose preparations proved wise, and such knowledge spreads quietly, strengthening resilience across regions, as snow finally retreats, almost entirely revealing brown earth and scattered shoots of green. You step outside without bracing yourself against a blast of icy wind, and the air feels new, carrying scents of thawing soil, damp with distant sea. You look back at the longhouse, its roof streaked with meltwater smoke rising thinner now, and you understand that it was more than shelter. It was a living structure, breathing with those inside it, holding warmth against relentless cold. Would you have survived Viking winter truly? With no modern insulation, no endless pantry, no heated floors or electric light, just wood, wool, smoke, and shared effort. Perhaps not easily, perhaps not comfortably, but survival was never about comfort. It was about rhythm, cooperation, caution, and a deep respect for the power of season. Winter was not an enemy to defeat, but a force to endure, to outlast patiently. Now, as spring settles more confidently across the north, and the memory of cold begins to soften, you can almost feel gratitude for having witnessed the cycle, from first frost to final thaw, from smoky darkness to growing light. So, as we let this long winter fade from our imagination, picture the hearth burning lower, not from neglect, but from need no longer so urgent. Picture doors open wide to fresh air, picture fields slowly greening under lengthening days. The Viking winter tested every sense, every resource, every relationship, and though you may have shivered, coughed on smoke, rationed your last handful of grain, you would also have stood in spring light knowing you endured something vast and ancient. And that quiet knowledge, that steady resilience, is perhaps the warmest feeling of all. Tonight, we leave the longhouse behind. Snow melted, stories told. Fire banked gently. Sleep well, and let the cold drift away. The gates close behind you, with a heavy wooden thud, thick iron bands sealing them tight. And just like that, the outside world of bustling markets and echoing mosques fades into a distant memory. Because once you pass into the imperial harem of Ottoman Empire, you do not simply walk back out again. You stand inside the vast palace complex of Topkapi, palace overlooking the waters of the Bosporus. But from here, the sea might as well not exist. Because the harem is a world folded inward, a labyrinth of tiled corridors, heavy doors, screened windows, and watchful eyes. The air smells faintly of rosewater and incense, layered over something subtler, human closeness, silk cushions, warmed by Bodhi's oil lamps, burning steadily along painted walls, and beneath it all a quiet tension that never quite leaves. This is not the fantasy many later storytellers imagined. Not merely a place of idle luxury, but a carefully controlled political machine, where power flows silently through whispers, glances, and the unpredictable moods of a single man, the Sultan. At the top of this enclosed universe stands the valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning ruler, often the most powerful woman in the empire. Her apartments positioned strategically within the complex, her authority unquestioned inside these walls, and her influence extending far beyond them. Below her are wives' favored consorts, concubines, attendants, each rank precisely ordered, each movement monitored. Because the harem is not chaos, it is structure rigid and deliberate, designed to ensure loyalty and prevent outside influence. And guarding it all are the eunuchs, most notably the chief black eunuch, known historically as the Kisler Akosk, whose quarters lie near the inner gates controlling access, like a living lock holding keys, both literal and symbolic becoming. A eunuch was not a gentle transition. Many were brought from regions in Africa, taken young, subjected to brutal procedures that ensured they could never father children. The surgery itself often performed in harsh conditions, far from palace walls survival. Not guaranteed, and those who did survive were shaped by pain into instruments of control. Inside the palace they rose through ranks, trained in discipline and secrecy, rewarded with authority, yet permanently marked by loss. Their loyalty tied directly to the Sultan's household, because they had no lineage to build outside it, no dynasty of their own to protect. You walk down a narrow corridor lined with blue Eisnick tiles, geometric patterns twisting endlessly across walls. The beauty almost hypnotic, yet every turn reminds you how easy it would be to become lost here. How many doors remain closed to you? Behind some of those doors, young women sit on low cushions, learning languages, music, embroidery, court etiquette, because entry into the harem did not mean immediate proximity to the ruler. It meant training, shaping, refinement into something considered worthy of attention. Many of these women arrived through complex systems of tribute and trade from the Caucasus, from Eastern Europe. From distant provinces of the empire, their names changed upon arrival, their pasts softened or erased, their futures uncertain. Competition here is quiet but relentless. Favor from the Sultan can elevate a woman to extraordinary status, granting her apartments of greater comfort, servants of her own, perhaps even the chance to bear a prince. And with that possibility comes both hope and danger, because bearing a prince means entering the heart of dynastic politics, where sons represent succession, and succession in the Ottoman system was historically ruthless. Brothers often seen not as companions, but as threats. Jealousy in such an environment does not require shouting. It moves through glances and rumors, through subtle shifts in who is invited to evening gatherings, through which gifts arrive and which do not. A silk robe here, a jeweled comb there. Small signs that signal favor. You might imagine laughter filling these halls, and yes, there are moments of music, of shared stories, of festivals, marked with sweets and lantern light, but beneath celebration runs calculation, because proximity to power is never neutral in certain periods of Ottoman history, especially during what scholars later called the Sultanate of Women. Figures like Harem Sultan rose from concubinage to extraordinary influence, advising rulers, shaping foreign policy, commissioning mosques and charities, and her ascent reshaped the balance inside the harem permanently. Her relationship with Suleiman the Magnificent altered traditions as he chose to legally marry her, an unusual act for an Ottoman sultan, and that singular decision intensified rivalries, particularly with Mahidevran, mother of another prince. Rivalry between mothers of princes could turn lethal, not always through open violence, but through exile, strategic marriages, whispered accusations, and in darker cases, executions ordered beyond these walls, because, while the harem itself was enclosed, its consequences reached outward into the empire. And then there is the tradition of fratricide, legalized under certain where newly enthroned rulers could order the execution of their brothers to secure stability, a practice later replaced by confinement in the caves, a secluded part of the palace where potential rivals lived under guarded isolation. Imagine being a young prince raised within the harem complex, aware that your future might mean supreme authority or silent suffocation by silk cord, dependent entirely on events beyond your control. The walls themselves seem to hold secrets, layers of conversations absorbed over centuries, promises made in hushed tones, alliances formed over shared cups of sherbet, betrayals concealed behind careful smiles. At night the palace quiets but never fully sleeps. Guards shift positions, oil lamps flicker in alcoves, footsteps echo softly across marble floors, and somewhere within the private chambers the Sultan's attention may rest upon one favored companion, altering destinies with a single preference. You begin to sense that escape is not merely physical impossibility, but structural illusion, because even those who gain influence remain bound to the institution, their children tied to its hierarchy, their security dependent on remaining within favor. Outside, the empire stretches across 3 continents. Armies march, treaties are signed, rebellions rise and fall. But inside, the harem decisions ripple outward in subtler ways, shaping succession, guiding alliances, influencing patronage networks, and always, the eunuchs stand at thresholds, keys at their belts, expressions unreadable, guardians of a system built on confinement and proximity. If you were placed here, stripped of your former identity, renamed, retrained, repositioned within this hierarchy, could you navigate its quiet rivalries, its unpredictable shifts of affection and authority? Because in the Ottoman imperial harem, survival required more than beauty or charm. It demanded patience, alliances, silence at the right moments, speech at precisely calculated ones. And as you move deeper into these corridors of tile and shadow, you realize this is only the outer layer of a far more intricate structure, one where jealousy can sharpen into conspiracy, and where a single whispered accusation might alter the fate of empires. The deeper you move into the harem, the quieter it becomes, not because it is empty, but because everyone understands that silence is survival, every footstep soft by layered carpets, every conversation lowered to a careful murmur, because walls in Topkapi Palace may be tiled in beauty, but they also carry sound. The chief black eunuch, Tekas Lara, As, does not shout orders. He rarely needs to. His authority rests in routine, in keys that unlock and lock with calm precision, in lists of names, in knowledge of who has been summoned and who has not. And information inside the harem is a currency more valuable than gold. Young concubines wake before sunrise, instructed by senior attendants in posture, in court language, in how to pour coffee without spilling a drop, because presentation is everything here. Even the angle of a bow can signal respect or defiance. Training is relentless but subtle. Correction delivered with firm whispers, a missed step in a dance noted carefully, a poorly chosen phrase remembered, because advancement depends on flawlessness, and flawlessness is watched constantly. Jealousy does not begin with murder, it begins with comparison, one woman noticing another's bracelet gifted perhaps by the Sultan after a private evening, another observing that a rival's quarters have been moved closer to the inner chamber's proximity, translating directly into influence. In such an enclosed world, small changes feel enormous. A door opened at night for one and not another, a festival. Seat placed slightly nearer to the ruler, a smile held a second longer than usual, and speculation grows quickly. The valid Sultan observes all of this with patient calculation, her power routed not only in motherhood but in experience. She has survived these corridors, navigated rivalries perhaps, lost friends along the way, and she understands that stability within the harem reflects stability in the empire ruled by her son. When a concubine bears a prince, celebration mixes instantly with tension, because motherhood elevates status dramatically, granting new apartments, additional servants, and more attention from the court. but it also paints a target under earlier sultans of the Ottoman Empire. The survival of multiple princes meant potential civil war, and history remembered bitter struggles between brothers. So the system evolved harshly, sometimes violently, to prevent fragmentation. In certain reigns, fratricide was enforced swiftly, princes executed upon the accession of a new sultan, often by silk cord, a method chosen, deliberately silent, and leaving no blood within palace walls, and the responsibility for such acts sometimes fell to trusted eunuchs, their loyalty binding them to tasks no one else could perform. Later confinement replaced execution, princes held within the caves, a secluded part of the palace complex, isolated for years. Sometimes decades cut off from governance, yet never free, and the psychological weight of that isolation could be crushing. Imagine being raised in luxury yet denied sunlight beyond latticed windows, hearing distant celebrations, but never joining them. Aware that your existence is both necessary and threatening, your fate determined entirely by succession. Inside the women's quarters, alliances form quietly, mothers of princes seeking protection for their sons, aligning with influential eunuchs, securing favor from the valid sultan, because in a structure this delicate survival depends on networks. Whispers of poisoning appear in some historical accounts, whether exaggerated or real tales of sherbet. Cups left unattended of sweets, laced with subtle toxins of illness, striking too conveniently. And while not every rumor was true, the atmosphere of suspicion was real enough to shape behavior. Even daily routines carry political weight. Invitations to dine in certain chambers, participation in religious observances, gifts exchanged during Ramadan festivals. Each gesture layered with meaning. The eunuchs themselves live in a complex position, powerful yet confined, commanding access, yet denied traditional family life. And among them, hierarchy exists as well, rivalries, unfolding behind guarded expressions, promotions granted by the sultan or influenced by the valid sultan. Punishments within the harem could be severe, though rarely public. A favored concubine falling from grace might find herself reassigned to remote quarters, married off to an official far from the capital, or quietly removed from influence altogether. In darker moments of Ottoman history, exile meant more than relocation. It could mean permanent disappearance, especially if political threat outweighed personal affection, and the unpredictability of a sultan's mood amplified this danger. Sultans were human, shaped by upbringing, by confinement within palace walls during childhood, by lessons in authority and suspicion, and their whims could elevate or destroy without warning. A sudden infatuation altering hierarchies overnight, a perceived insult erasing years of favor. Figures like Kaksum Sultan demonstrate how formidable a valet could become, serving as regent for young sons, guiding imperial policy, navigating factional politics not only within the harem but across the entire court. Yet even she faced opposition and eventual violent downfall. Power here is never permanent. It shifts like light through lattice screens, sometimes warm and golden, sometimes vanishing entirely. And those inside learn to read its patterns carefully. At night, after formal gatherings conclude, smaller circles form, trusted companions sharing quiet conversation, discussing which official has gained influence, which provincial governor has fallen from favor, because the harem is not disconnected from empire. It is intertwined with it. Letters pass discreetly, messages conveyed through intermediaries, recommendations made for appointments or pardons, and while the outer world sees only the sultan's seal. Often the impulse began within these chambers. Yet for every woman who rises, many remain in obscurity, trained, housed, fed, yet never summoned, their lives unfolding within marble corridors, without ever touching the center of power, and their escape is unlikely. Because release depends on arrangement, marriage granted by authority, not personal choice. You walk again past tiled walls, noticing the repetition of patterns, endless geometry, symbolizing order, stability, control, and you realize the architecture itself reinforces confinement. Beauty layered over restriction. The harem gardens, enclosed yet lush, offer brief respite. Fountains, murmuring softly, citrus trees, scenting the air. But even here, guards remain nearby and beyond high walls. The city of Istanbul continues unaware of individual rivalries unfolding inside. If you were placed here, could you endure the constant awareness that your future hinges on favor? That a single misstep might redirect your entire life? Because within the Ottoman imperial harem, survival is not about open rebellion, it is about adaptation, silence, when necessary, strategic kindness, carefully chosen alliances, and the patience to wait through unpredictable storms of mood and politics. And as the lamps dim and corridors settle into deeper quiet, you sense that beneath the calm exterior, currents of ambition and fear continue to flow, shaping destinies unseen. Morning inside the imperial harem does not begin with sunlight flooding the room. It begins with movement, soft footsteps along tiled corridors, fabric brushing against fabric, a door unlocking somewhere deeper inside Topkapi Palace. The rhythm of the day is controlled, structured, almost ritualistic, because order is protection, and disorder invites suspicion. Young women rise from cushioned divans, folding embroidered blankets, neatly adjusting silk robes, braiding hair carefully under the supervision of senior attendants. There is no wandering aimlessly here. Every hour has purpose: music lessons in one chamber, recitation practice in another, sewing circles, arranged in quiet arcs, beneath latticed windows, sunlight filtering in patterned shapes across polished floors. You begin to understand that the harem is an academy as much as a residence, training its inhabitants not only in beauty, but in language, diplomacy, poetry, religion, because any woman elevated to the Sultan's attention must represent refinement. Yet beneath refinement lies tension, because advancement narrows the circle. And with each new favorite, someone else's influence fades, and fading influence in this enclosed world feels like suffocation. The chief black eunuch ever watchful monitors these shifts, his loyalty pledged to the dynasty of the Ottoman Empire above all, and when conflict threatens stability, he may intervene, quietly reassigning attendants, separating rivals, redirecting gossip before it becomes scandal. But not all tension can be smoothed away. Jealousy sometimes grows sharper than caution, particularly when a prince is born, because motherhood changes everything. The mother of a prince gains status immediately. Her apartments improved, her servants increased, her access to the Sultan more regular, and in earlier centuries she might travel with her son to a provincial governorship, shaping his early training and building alliances beyond palace walls. Later, as succession practices changed, princes remained closer to the capital, and their mothers remained within the harem, intensifying competition within these confined corridors. History remembers figures like Nurbanu Sultan, who maneuvered carefully through such rivalries, cultivating allies among eunuchs and court officials, ensuring her son's position strengthened even before he ascended the throne. In an environment where the future sultan might be any one of several boys, each supported by an ambitious mother, tension could simmer for years. Polite smiles, masking strategic calculation, shared meals concealing quiet fear, rumors of poisoning occasionally surface in chronicles, cups of sherbet suspected, sweets examined cautiously before being tasted. And whether every story is accurate matters less than the atmosphere they created, one of constant vigilance. You imagine lifting a cup offered by a rival, noticing her steady gaze, wondering briefly what intentions swirled beneath her calm expression. And even if the drink is harmless, the doubt itself becomes corrosive. Punishments inside the harem rarely unfolded dramatically in open courtyards. They were more often administrative reassignment to lesser quarters, marriage, arranged to a distant official relocation away from influence. Yet such decisions could feel like exile for you. Discipline was equally strict. Loyalty tested repeatedly, any hint of divided allegiance treated seriously, because access to the inner chambers meant proximity to state secrets. There are accounts, sometimes exaggerated by foreign observers, describing harsh interrogations of servants suspected of conspiracy, the fear of betrayal shaping an environment where trust had to be earned slowly and guarded carefully. Meanwhile, the Sultan's moods could alter everything overnight, a passing irritation leading to sudden dismissal, a spontaneous affection elevating a previously unnoticed concubine to prominence. And because his authority was absolute within these walls, no appeal existed beyond his will. Sultans themselves were shaped by confinement, many raised largely within palace grounds, educated intensely yet shielded from ordinary life, their emotional worlds compressed into limited spaces, and this isolation sometimes amplified suspicion or unpredictability. When a new sultan ascended, tension reached its peak. brothers either executed or confined within the caves, mothers of defeated princes facing uncertain futures, and the harem held its breath, collectively aware that one reign ending meant structures shifting entirely. Consider the reign of Murad IV, known for severity, whose rule followed years of instability. His mother, Sultan, acting as regent during his youth, navigating volatile politics both inside and outside the palace. Her influence demonstrated how deeply the harem could shape imperial direction, yet even she eventually fell victim to factional conflict, reportedly strangled within the palace during a power struggle, a stark reminder that no rank guaranteed safety indefinitely. The walls of the harem absorb such history silently. Fountains continue to murmur, gardens bloom each spring, yet beneath that serenity lies memory of ambition and downfall intertwined. You walk past a carved wooden screen and glimpse the courtyard beyond sunlight, catching on marble a moment of stillness, and you realize that for many women here, this courtyard is the widest horizon they will ever know. Escape, in a literal sense, is nearly impossible. Guarded gates, loyal eunuchs, societal expectations, all binding tightly, but escape also feels impossible in a psychological sense, because years spent within these hierarchies reshape identity itself. Names changed upon arrival become permanent. Languages shift, loyalties realign, and the outside world grows distant, almost abstract. Even joy inside the harem carries layers. Music performed during festivals, henna applied to hands during celebrations, laughter shared during private gatherings. Yet each joyful moment exists alongside awareness that fortune can reverse swiftly. In the evenings, when oil lamps glow warmly against patterned tiles, some residents may sit quietly reflecting on past lives. Faraway mountains of the Caucasus, villages in the Balkans, families left behind, memories softened but not erased entirely. And in those quiet reflections lies perhaps the deepest truth of the harem. It is a place of extraordinary luxury and profound confinement at the same time. A world of silk cushions and guarded thresholds, of influence that could shape empires and vulnerability that could erase a life overnight. If you stood here long enough, would you learn to navigate its currents, to balance ambition with caution, to read the subtle signals that determine favor? Because within these marble corridors, survival depends less on strength and more on perception, the ability to sense shifting alliances before they are spoken aloud. And as night settles once more over Topkapi Palace, the lamps dimming slowly, you feel that beneath the calm surface, new rivalries are already forming, new ambitions quietly taking root. Now imagine the nights when the palace finally goes quiet, when the musicians pack away their loot, when the last lantern in the outer courtyard flickers low, and the women of the harem lie awake in their silk bedding, staring into darkness that never truly feels safe. Because silence in the harem is never peaceful, it is watchful, it is listening, it is waiting for the smallest sound of shifting power. A door opening somewhere down a marble hallway, a messenger running softly across carpets, a eunuch whispering a name that might not be yours, and you begin to understand that fear here does not shout, it breathes quietly beside you. By this point in your imaginary captivity, you have learned the rhythms of rivalry, the subtle glances across the bath, steam the way compliments are shaped like honey but hide needles. You know that a woman's smile can be a weapon sharper than any blade carried by the palace guards, because open violence inside the harem is rare, but not unheard of. And when it happens, it is swift, contained, erased from official memory as though it were only a passing cough in a grand hall. Jealousy here is not loud screaming or dramatic confrontation. It is slow pressure, like water wearing down stone. A favorite concubine receives a new necklace from the Sultan. Another woman notices. Another woman counts the number of nights that necklace sparkles in candlelight, and she begins to plan small humiliations, perhaps a rumor about disobedience, perhaps a subtle reminder whispered to a powerful valid sultan that this favored girl once hesitated during a formal greeting, and that hesitation can be inflated into disrespect. The harem is built on proximity to power, and proximity creates heat, and heat creates rivalry. Because every woman knows that one child, just one son, can elevate her from obscurity to influence. And sons in the Ottoman world are not just babies wrapped in cloth. They are futures. They are insurance. They are shields. And sometimes, they are targets. There are stories passed down in hushed tones about children who fell suddenly ill, about mothers who wept beside small wooden cradles while physicians shook their heads gravely. And whether those deaths were natural or arranged becomes less important than the atmosphere of suspicion they leave behind. Because once you believe that someone might poison a cup of sherbet or mix something strange into sweetened milk, you will never drink comfortably again. And so meals inside the harem are rituals of caution. Trays are inspected, tasters are used, silver lids are lifted carefully. And even then, eyes flicker from plate to plate, calculating, measuring, wondering who benefits if you fail to wake tomorrow. Meanwhile, the eunuchs move silently through all of it, carrying messages, enforcing discipline, guarding doors. Their loyalty belonging not to affection but to survival. And you might imagine that their lives are simpler because they are not competing for the Sultan's favor in the same way. But their existence is a tightrope walk as well. Because a powerful eunuch who angers the wrong princess or backs the wrong heir can find himself removed from influence overnight. Punishment in the palace rarely needs to be loud. It can be administrative. A transfer to a distant posting, a demotion to a smaller chamber, a quiet disappearance into a provincial assignment where marble floors are replaced by damp stone. An influence evaporates like mist in morning sun. Inside the women's quarters, alliances form and dissolve like shifting sand to concubines, may share confidences for months, braiding each other's hair, laughing softly over embroidery hoops only for one to receive unexpected attention from the Sultan, and suddenly warmth turns cool and laughter becomes strained, and every shared secret feels dangerous. You would learn quickly not to speak carelessly, because words inside the harem do not vanish. They travel, they echo, they transform, and by the time they reach a senior figure, they may sound nothing like what you originally whispered. And correcting that distortion is nearly impossible once authority has decided on a version of truth. The valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan, sits at the center of this delicate web, her power immense, her gaze sharp. She observes the rivalries with the patience of someone who understands that time always reveals ambition, and sometimes she encourages competition, because divided women cannot unite against the throne. But division has consequences, because stress settles into bodies, into stomachs, knotted with anxiety into sleepless nights where every creak of wood sounds like destiny approaching, and you begin to realize that escape is not only physically impossible, it is mentally unthinkable. Because where would you go? Who would believe you? What life exists outside these guarded walls for someone shaped entirely by palace rules? Even the architecture reinforces containment. High windows admit light, but not freedom. Courtyards are beautiful yet enclosed. Fountains murmur softly yet never lead to rivers. And you would pace those tiled corridors feeling both sheltered and trapped, wrapped in luxury that functions like a gilded cage. Occasionally, the Sultan's whims shift everything overnight, a sudden fascination with a new face, a passing boredom with an old favorite, and positions change, like pieces on a chessboard. Rooms reassigned, attendants, redistributed, gifts reclaimed or bestowed, and with each shift hearts race, because security here is temporary. Some women attempt to secure their futures through piety, spending long hours in prayer, donating to charitable works, cultivating an image of humility that might protect them from harsher judgment. Others rely on beauty and charm, refining dance movements, perfecting poetry, memorizing verses that might catch the Sultan's ear during an evening gathering, and each strategy carries risk, because too much visibility invites envy, too little invites neglect. The fear of jealousy killings whispered about in later tales rests less in constant bloodshed and more in the awareness that intense rivalry can push desperate actions. A silk cord can be used for many things. A balcony can be dangerously high, and official explanations are always tidy, always convenient. You might lie awake, replaying conversations in your mind, wondering if that compliment from a rival was genuine or bait. Wondering if the servant who lingered by your door was merely curious, or counting how many times you cough at night in paranoia. Becomes a companion, quiet but persistent. And then there are the nightmares not only of physical harm, but of social erasure, of being forgotten, of watching another woman cradle the Sultan's son, while you fade into ceremonial invisibility. Because in the Ottoman world, legacy matters, and the mother of a prince carries weight that reshapes her entire existence. When a prince is born, celebrations ripple through the palace. Drums beat softly in distant courtyards. Sweets are distributed, and yet behind every congratulatory smile is calculation, because that child changes succession politics, and succession politics determine survival. Brothers may one day stand against brothers, and mothers know this. They know that raising a son in the palace is not only about lullabies and gentle rocking. It is about preparing him for a future where mercy can be dangerous, and that knowledge settles heavy on their hearts. You can imagine the way they watch their son sleep, tracing small fingers with trembling hands, aware that love here is intertwined with strategy, that affection cannot be separated from ambition, and that the boy's fate will one day pull them into currents far beyond these quiet chambers. Meanwhile, daily routines continue: baths, scented with rosewater, lessons in etiquette, endless stitching of elaborate garments. And repetition becomes soothing in its own way, because predictability offers small comfort in a world where larger forces shift unpredictably. The eunuchs continued their patrols, keys jingling softly at their waists, their footsteps measured, their expressions disciplined. They have seen, too, many rises and falls to react visibly to palace drama, and their restraint becomes part of the atmosphere. Calm surfaces, hiding turbulent undercurrents. At times you might catch a glimpse of the outside world through lattice screens. Hear distant market sounds drifting faintly from beyond palace walls, and that reminder of ordinary life feels almost unreal, as though it belongs to another lifetime entirely. Inside, everything is curated, controlled, orchestrated, yet beneath that order pulses raw human emotion, fear, desire, envy, hope, regret, and these feelings swirl together in a constant low hum, like the echo of footsteps in a marble corridor that never fully fades. As years pass within this enclosed universe, some women adapt so completely that the outside world becomes abstract. They learn to navigate hierarchy with graceful precision. They measure their words carefully. They cultivate patience like a craft, and in doing so, they survive. But survival is not the same as freedom, and even the most powerful woman in the harem answers ultimately to the sultan's mood, to political shifts beyond her control, to rumors that may surface without warning, and that dependence shapes every breath taken inside those ornate rooms. You might think luxury softens fear, but silk cushions do not quiet anxious thoughts, and gold embroidery does not guarantee tomorrow's safety. And as you lie there in imagined darkness, listening to the palace settle around you, you would understand that the true prison is uncertainty. And uncertainty never truly sleeps. It waits beside you, counting heartbeats, measuring loyalty, testing patience, and in the faint glow of an oil lamp, you would realize that escaping the Ottoman harem was not simply a matter of unlocked doors. It required escaping an entire system of power rivalry, an expectation that wrapped around every life within its walls, tightening gently but persistently until resistance felt impossible. And as the years stretch forward inside those tiled corridors, you begin to understand that the greatest danger in the harem is not a single act of cruelty, but time itself, because time reshapes alliances, ages beauty, strengthens some bonds, and weakens others. And in the Ottoman court, time is always moving toward one inevitable question: who will rule next? Succession in the empire is not a gentle transfer of power. It is a storm that gathers slowly, silently, while mothers watch their sons grow from playful boys into cautious young men. And each lesson the princes receive carries weight. Lessons in swordplay, in poetry, in leadership. And beneath every tutor's instruction rests an unspoken truth. Only one of you may sit on the throne. For centuries, the practice of fratricide haunted the dynasty, the grim understanding that brothers could be executed to secure the new sultan's reign. And though policies changed over time, the fear never entirely vanished. It lingered in corridors like the faint scent of extinguished candles, and the women of the harem knew this better than anyone, because their children's lives were tied to political survival. Imagine standing beside a window screened with carved wood, watching your son practice in the courtyard below, hearing the soft clash of wooden swords, and wondering whether those hands will one day sign death warrants for his own siblings, or whether he will instead become the one locked away in a gilded cage known as the cafes, the cage where princes sometimes lived in isolation to prevent rebellion, and the thought alone is enough to tighten your chest. Inside the harem, whispers move faster than official announcements. A minor illness of the sultan becomes a ripple of speculation. A cough during an audience becomes an omen, and suddenly the atmosphere thickens. Servants walk more carefully, eunuchs exchange quiet looks, and mothers begin calculating how prepared their sons truly are. Preparation here is not only about strength or intelligence, it is about alliances, about which officials favor which prince, about whether the janissaries might support one claim over another, and though the women of the harem do not march with armies, they influence through conversation, through gifts, through carefully timed kindnesses that plant loyalty like seeds in fertile soil. But influence is fragile, because a single accusation of intrigue can undo years of patient networking, and the punishment for perceived manipulation can be swift removal from favor, exile to an older palace, or confinement within smaller quarters where one's grand apartments shrink into quiet obscurity. You might imagine the sound of heavy doors closing behind you, the echo final, the realization settling slowly that your era of influence has ended, and that is a different kind of torture. The torture of irrelevance. Meanwhile, the eunuchs continue to serve as the invisible framework holding this world together, especially the chief black eunuch, who controls access to the Sultan and oversees much of the harem's internal order. His authority immense, yet always dependent on the ruler's trust, and if that trust falters, his fall can be as dramatic as any concubine's. There are records of eunuchs who rose to extraordinary power, managing foundations, advising on appointments, even shaping policy indirectly. And yet their bodies bore the mark of their forced loyalty, a reminder that their influence was born from violence, inflicted long ago, and that contradiction sits quietly beneath every polished command they give. Daily life continues even as political tension builds. Women embroider elaborate kaftanas, recite verses of poetry, practice music in softly lit rooms where candlelight flickers against painted ceilings, and repetition becomes a comfort, because when larger events feel uncontrollable, small routines steady the mind. You might trace the same floral pattern in silk thread day after day, feeling the texture beneath your fingers, letting the predictability calm your racing thoughts, because outside that embroidery hoop lies a world of shifting loyalties and uncertain futures. Sometimes a sultan's whim interrupts everything, a sudden decision to favor a different residence, a spontaneous celebration, a new architectural project within the palace grounds, and entire sections of the harem reorganize overnight rooms. Reassigned attendants shuffled, hierarchies adjusted, and each change forces everyone to reassess their position. Whim here is not trivial. It is policy shaped by personality, and personality at the top determines the emotional climate for hundreds within these walls. Consider a sultan prone to suspicion, his doubts trickling downward, causing interrogations, tighter surveillance, stricter rules on communication, and the harem grows quieter. Laughter fades, glances become guarded, while a more relaxed ruler might allow music to drift longer into the evening, permitting a sense of warmth that feels almost like safety. But even during calmer reigns, the memory of past upheavals lingers. Stories of deposition, of sultans removed by palace coups, of mothers scrambling to protect their sons as janissaries filled courtyards with shouts and steel. And those stories are retold in hushed voices to younger women who listen, absorbing lessons wrapped in caution. Jealousy killings, whether rare or exaggerated in later tales, symbolize the extreme edge of rivalry, and even if most conflicts never reach that point, the awareness that desperation can drive someone to violence is enough to keep everyone alert. A loose step on a marble stair, a railing that gives way unexpectedly, a cup left unattended for a moment too long, and you begin to see how silly accidents can be interpreted as intention, or intention disguised as accident. The psychological weight of this constant vigilance shapes posture, speech, even breathing. You learn to move gracefully but carefully, to speak warmly but vaguely, to reveal just enough emotion to seem sincere without exposing vulnerability, and over time, that performance becomes second nature. Children raised within this environment absorb its tension as well, princes playing games that echo military drills, little girls watching their mothers navigate hierarchy with precision, learning early that affection and strategy are intertwined. Education in the harem is often rigorous, languages, calligraphy, theology, music, because refinement enhances value, and value enhances security, yet no amount of education shields completely from political shifts beyond one's control. As the empire itself expands or contracts beyond palace walls, news filters inward. Slowly victories, celebrated with measured pride, defeats met with subdued anxiety. And the women of the harem understand that external instability can translate into internal upheaval, because weak rule invites challenge, and challenge reshapes succession. You might sit beside a fountain in an enclosed courtyard, listening to water splash gently against stone, breathing in the scent of jasmine at dusk, and for a fleeting moment feel almost peaceful, almost convinced that this ornate enclosure is enough. Then footsteps echo somewhere beyond the archway. A messenger approaches, and the fragile calm fractures into alertness once more. Because every message carries possibility. Possibility of promotion, of demotion, of celebration, of mourning, and so life inside the Ottoman harem becomes a cycle of waiting and reacting, waiting for favor, reacting to rumor, waiting for births, reacting to deaths, waiting for decisions made far above your station, reacting to their consequences. Escape in such a world is not merely physical departure. It would require shedding layers of identity built around proximity to power, unlearning habits of guarded speech, relearning what it means to exist without constant calculation, and for many, that transformation is unimaginable. Some women eventually leave through marriage arranged to loyal officials, stepping into new households where they carry prestige from their palace years. Yet even then their past shadows them, their knowledge of court politics shaping how they move through any space thereafter. Others remain until age softens rivalry, until younger faces replace them in the delicate dance of favor, and they transition into quieter roles. Mentors to newcomers, custodians of stories that blend truth and embellishment, recounting past tensions with a tone that is almost soothing, as though distance has dulled the sharpest edges. But beneath those stories lies the constant thread that defined their youth, the understanding that, within those glittering walls, survival depended on awareness, patience, and sometimes ruthless pragmatism. As night settles once more over the palace, lanterns dimmed, corridors hushed, the air heavy with the lingering scent of incense. You might imagine lying on a low-cushioned bed, staring upward at painted ceilings fading into shadow, aware that tomorrow could alter everything or nothing at all. And in that suspended stillness, you realize the truth of it, that the Ottoman harem was not simply a place of indulgence or cruelty, but a complex web of human ambition, fear, loyalty, and love, compressed within marble walls, shaped by Sultan's whims and sustained by the quiet endurance of those who lived within. There are no easy endings here. Only transitions. Rulers replaced favorites, forgotten children grown into leaders or prisoners, and through it all, the palace remains absorbing footsteps, absorbing secrets, its tiles, cool, beneath generations of anxious pacing. You would not escape easily, because the system itself wraps around you like silk soft yet binding, and even if doors opened wide one morning, part of you would still listen for distant footsteps, still measure your words, still expect the subtle shift of power that defined every day inside those walls. And as our slow journey through these shadowed corridors comes to rest, the echoes remain soft and persistent, reminding us that history's most ornate rooms often contain its most intricate cages. End of topic. The Nile rises slowly in the darkness, thick and silent, pressing against its muddy banks as if the river itself is breathing in its sleep. And somewhere beyond the reeds, a temple lamp flickers against carved stone, and inside that temple, a priest whispers the name of a living god, because that is what the pharaoh is believed to be. Not merely a king, not simply a ruler, but a divine body walking under the sun. And when a man is treated as a god from birth, when every gesture is interpreted as cosmic will, when every desire is framed as sacred necessity, the boundaries that restrain ordinary people begin to blur, and sometimes they vanish entirely. The royal palace at Memphis, or Thebes, does not feel like a home in the way we imagine one. It feels like an extension of heaven, forced under earth, columns painted in blues and golds, floors cooled beneath bare feet, incense smoke curling upward, like a bridge to the sky, and at the center of it all stands the pharaoh, draped in linen so fine it almost disappears in the light, adorned with collars of lapis and gold that glint like captured sunlight. But divinity comes with peculiar expectations, because to preserve divine blood, the royal line often turns inward, brother to sister, father to daughter. In some cases, marriage is arranged not for romance, but for purity of lineage, because the gods themselves are said to have married within their own divine families. And so, the royal household mirrors myth. To the ancient Egyptian mind, this is not scandalous, it is symbolic, a reflection of cosmic order. Yet inside the palace walls, such unions create tension, because even sacred justification cannot erase human discomfort. Whispers among servants, careful glances, the quiet understanding that the royal family lives by rules entirely separate from the rest of society. Imagine a young princess raised within perfumed chambers, taught that she is descended from Ra, the sun god, and that her destiny may be to marry her own brother to maintain balance in the universe. She grows up hearing this, not as a choice, but as inevitability. And inevitability shapes obedience. The ceremonies themselves are grand garlands of flowers, musicians plucking harps, softly priests chanting blessings that echo against sandstone walls, and the couple stands beneath painted ceilings depicting stars embodying the myth of Isis and Osiris reborn on earth outside. The palace common farmers watch the Nile's level with far more practical concern, because while royalty worries about divine bloodlines, peasants worry about water, about whether the flood will be generous or cruel this year, whether the silts left behind will nourish their crops, or whether drought will crack the fields into dry fragments. The pharaoh's role in this natural cycle is not symbolic alone. He is believed to control it, his righteousness ensuring the river's rhythm, and so, when floods fail or arrive too violently, murmurs spread. Perhaps the king has displeased the gods, perhaps cosmic order is disturbed. This belief places immense pressure on the ruler, because nature itself becomes a judgment on his body and actions. And in response, pharaohs invest heavily in ritual, in offerings, in building projects meant to prove devotion, towering temples rising along the Nile's edge, as if stone could persuade the heavens. Within those temples, priests conduct daily rites to sustain divine favor, washing statues of gods, dressing them in fresh linen, presenting food offerings that only priests may consume afterward, and all of it reinforces the idea that the world depends on careful ceremony. Now consider the obsession with death that defines so much of ancient Egyptian culture, the belief that life continues beyond the tomb, that the body must be preserved to house the soul, and so the process of mummification becomes not merely practical, but sacred. Inside embalming workshops, the air is heavy with natron and resin. The smell sharp and lingering, bodies laid upon stone tables while specialists work methodically, removing organs, drying flesh, wrapping limbs in endless strips of linen, and for royalty the process is elaborate. Protective amulets placed between layers, spells whispered over each fold. The pharaoh's body in particular must remain intact, because if the god-king decays improperly, cosmic stability could unravel. And this fear fuels both precision and paranoia. Tales of mummy curses arise centuries later, stories warning grave robbers that disturbing a royal tomb invites misfortune, illness, even death. And while many of these curses are exaggerated by later imagination, the ancient Egyptians did inscribe warnings meant to protect sacred resting places. Picture a tomb chamber deep beneath desert rock walls, covered in painted scenes of harvests, banquets, and journeys through the underworld, the air dry and still, and upon a sealed sarcophagus, hieroglyphs cautioning any intruder that divine retribution awaits those who disturb eternal sleep. These warnings reflect not superstition alone, but a fierce commitment to afterlife security, because eternity for a pharaoh must mirror the grandeur of his earthly reign. Meanwhile, the Nile continues its slow cycle, swelling and retreating, indifferent to royal anxieties. And in years when floods overwhelm villages, washing away homes, drowning livestock, desperation seeps through the population, and the king must respond with grain from state's relief efforts framed as divine generosity. If he fails, resentment grows quietly, even in a society that reveres him as God, because hunger tests faith. Inside palace walls, lavish banquets contrast sharply with rural scarcity. Platters of roasted fowl, figs soaked in honey, wine poured into alabaster cups. And such abundance reinforces separation between ruler and ruled. The pharaoh's obsessions are not always purely ritual or familial. They extend to monumental legacy pyramids, obelisks, colossal statues carved in his likeness, each structure proclaiming permanence, yet beneath that drive lies anxiety, the fear of being forgotten, of fading into dust without leaving a mark large enough to defy time. Construction projects demand immense labor teams of workers hauling stone blocks beneath scorching sun, overseers shouting instructions, chisels striking limestone in rhythmic pulses. And the scale of these endeavors reflects a ruler's desire to imprint himself onto eternity, but obsession with permanence can strain resources. And when combined with erratic Nile floods, the balance of prosperity wavers, and the divine narrative must work harder to justify earthly hardship. Within the royal household, family dynamics grow complicated. Siblings raised as future spouses navigating roles that blur affection and duty. Children born into expectations that feel heavier than the gold collars around their necks. A young prince might gaze upon temple carvings, depicting gods marrying their sisters, and feel pride mixed with quiet confusion. Because mythology does not erase human emotion, it merely frames it. Priests reinforce ideology daily, reminding the royal family that they embody divine archetypes that their unions sustain. The cosmic order that keeps chaos at bay and so private discomfort is absorbed into public symbolism. As the sun sets over the Nile each evening, turning water to molten copper, temple chant rise once more, prayers for balance, for steady floods, for continued prosperity. And within the palace corridors, servants move quietly, oil lamps casting long shadows across painted walls. Somewhere in those corridors, a royal couple shares a chamber adorned with lotus motifs, their marriage less about companionship and more about lineage. And outside that chamber, guards stand watch, protecting not just individuals but an idea. The idea that divine blood must remain unbroken. Meanwhile, in villages, farmers sleep lightly, listening for distant rumblings of water, calculating whether this season will bless or betray them, their lives tethered to the same river that symbolizes royal power. Thus, obsession in ancient Egypt intertwines with necessity, incest framed as sacred duty, mummification as eternal insurance, monumental building as defense against oblivion, and the Nile's flood as divine approval or condemnation. And as night deepens across desert sands, stars sharp against black, sky the pharaoh dreams within perfumed chambers, unaware perhaps of the quiet doubts that ripple beyond palace walls. Softened by faith but never entirely erased, the river breathes again in darkness, rising and falling as it has for millennia. Indifferent to human obsession, yet shaping every aspect of it, and within this delicate balance of divinity and vulnerability, the seeds of both glory and fragility take root, deep inside the palace, beyond painted courtyards and echoing halls. The royal nursery hums softly with guarded expectation, because every child born to a pharaoh carries not only hope, but calculation. And when that child is born of a union between brother and sister, the symbolism grows even heavier. The cradle is carved from polished wood, inlaid with ivory, tiny gold charms hanging from its sides to ward off evil, and priestesses murmur protective spells, while servants move carefully, aware that this infant represents continuity of divine blood. Yet, biology does not always bend to belief, and generations of tightly woven lineage can bring fragility, illnesses that arrive without clear cause, limbs that do not grow as strong as hoped. And though ancient Egyptians did not understand genetics as we do, they recognized patterns. They noticed weakness, and such weakness threatened the illusion of perfect divinity. When a royal child fell ill, the response was immediate and layered. Physicians applying poultices made of honey and herbs, amulets pressed against tiny chests, spells recited over and over in dim lamplight, because medicine and magic were inseparable, and to fail in either was to risk cosmic imbalance. If the child survived, celebrations reaffirmed divine favor. If the child died, explanations shifted carefully toward fate, toward mysterious will of the gods, never toward questioning the sacred marriage that produced the heir. Within these walls, obsession with purity coexists with quiet fear of imperfection. And that tension lingers like incense smoke, sweet but suffocating. Meanwhile, embalmers continue their sacred craft in workshops near the Nile, their hands stained with resin, their tools laid out with ritual precision, because death is never far from royal life, and preparation for eternity begins long before final breath. Pharaohs often commissioned their tombs early in their reign, vast complexes carved into cliffs or rising as pyramids from desert floor. Corridors mapped carefully to align with stars, chambers designed to house treasures meant for the afterlife, and each carving along the wall acts as insurance, a story etched in stone to guide the soul safely beyond judgment. The Book of the Dead, or rather a collection of spells we call by that name, is copied onto papyrus and tucked beside coffins' instructions. for navigating the underworld, for answering the gods correctly, for ensuring the heart is lighter than the feather of mat. And here again obsession reveals itself because the pharaoh's fear is not simply death, it is annihilation, the possibility that memory might fade or that the soul might fail its trial. And so redundancy becomes comfort, more spells, more amulets, more layers of linen, more carvings, as if excess can guarantee eternity. Outside the royal sphere, the Nile begins to swell, earlier than expected, 1 year waters creeping over fields before harvest is complete. Farmers, scrambling to gather grain, livestock herded to higher ground, anxiety rippling through villages like wind across reeds. When floods are too strong, they drown not only crops, but confidence, because the people believe the pharaoh's harmony with the gods regulates this river, and if chaos erupts, whispers begin. Perhaps rituals were neglected, perhaps the king has angered a deity inside temple courts. Priests double their offerings, oxen sacrificed, incense burned thicker, chants extended late into night. The air heavy with urgency, the pharaoh himself may participate in elaborate ceremonies standing barefoot upon cool stone, pouring libations into sacred basins, his voice echoing through towering columns as he calls upon Hape, spirit of the Nile. To restore balance, these public rituals serve a dual purpose: spiritual reassurance and political theater, because the sight of a divine king pleading or commanding the gods reinforces belief that someone is in control, even when nature proves otherwise. And yet nature remains indifferent. The river recedes, when it will, leaving behind either fertile silt or cracked disappointment, and in the aftermath state granaries become crucial, their doors opened or kept closed according to policy and capacity. Famine years test the limits of royal divinity, thin faces appearing in temple courtyards seeking relief, mothers clutching children whose ribs show through skin. And while official inscriptions emphasize generosity, the strain beneath such years lingers long after waters settle. Back in the palace, life maintains its rhythm of ritual and indulgence, perfumed oils massaged into skin, elaborate wigs, adjusted carefully, mirrors of polished bronze, reflecting faces trained to appear serene because composure itself is part of sacred performance. But beneath painted eyelids, thoughts churn, especially among royal women whose status depends on producing sons, because in a system obsessed with lineage, fertility becomes both power and pressure. A queen without a male heir may feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, rival wives advancing subtly, alliances and even within incestuous unions, affection does not erase competition. Whispers travel through servant networks, news of pregnancies spreading before official announcements, and tension builds quietly in shared bathhouses, where women soak in warm water scented with lotus, exchanging pleasantries edged with calculation. The pharaoh, raised to believe in his own divinity, may indulge personal fascinations as well, commissioning statues that exaggerate youth, demanding festivals that celebrate his vitality, surrounding himself with symbols of eternal strength. Obsession with image intertwines with fear of decay, and nowhere is decay more terrifying than in the body, which must remain whole for afterlife survival. This fear fuels meticulous burial preparation, internal organs removed and stored in canopic jars, guarded by protective deities, the brain extracted through careful incisions, the body dried for 40 days, beneath natron salts until moisture is drawn away, leaving skin tightened over bone. The process is clinical, yet reverent, and when complete the mummy is wrapped layer upon layer, each strip of linen accompanied by murmured words meant to shield against corruption. Centuries later, tales of curses will exaggerate this protective instinct into deadly legend, but in its origin the curse is less about revenge and more about defense. A warning carved in stone that the sacred boundary between living and eternal must not be crossed still. The idea of vengeance from beyond the grave captures imagination because it mirrors the living king's authority. Just as he commands in life, he may punish in death. As seasons turn and floods rise and fall, the cycle of obsession continues. Marriage reinforcing myth, ritual reinforcing control, mummification reinforcing permanence, and each element feeds the others, creating a culture deeply invested in resisting chaos. At dusk along the Nile, the sky turns violet. Ibis birds settling among reeds, fishermen pulling in nets, heavy or light depending on fortune, and somewhere in a palace chamber, a royal couple performs duties framed as sacred but lived as human. In that contrast lies the heart of ancient Egypt's complexity, grand cosmic narrative layered over fragile human experience, and the more tightly the elite cling to divine symbolism, the more carefully they must manage the cracks that appear beneath it. For every monumental temple rising toward the sun, there is a farmer kneeling in mud, hoping next year's flood will be kinder. And for every spell inscribed on a tomb wall, there is a quiet anxiety that perhaps words alone cannot command eternity. The Nile continues its patient rhythm, neither moral nor malicious, simply flowing as it always has. While along its banks, kings and queens weave obsessions into stone, into flesh, into legacy, hoping to outlast the river itself. Far from the bright courtyards and painted ceilings, beyond the reach of perfumed air, the desert waits in silence, and in that silence, the tomb builders work, slowly, methodically carving eternity out of stone, because, while the living pharaoh basks in sunlight, his shadow is already being prepared underground. The valley of the kings lies dry and still beneath, a hard blue sky, cliffs rising like broken teeth, and within those cliffs narrow corridors snake inward, lit by flickering oil lamps that stain the walls with smoke. Artisans bent over plaster painting scenes of the underworld in careful strokes of red, blue, and gold. Each image is deliberate. The pharaoh sailing with Ra across the sky, the pharaoh standing before Osiris in judgment, the pharaoh reborn with the sunrise. And repetition itself becomes a kind of reassurance, because if the story is carved enough times, perhaps it cannot fail. This is obsession in physical form, a ruler planning every step of his afterlife decades before death, ensuring that even in darkness he will be surrounded by servants sculpted from wood, by shabdi figurines meant to labor on his behalf in the next world. In hidden chambers, craftsmen construct nested coffins, one inside another, each layer more ornate than the last. Gold hammered thin over carved wood, faces shaped to resemble ideal youth rather than aged reality. Because eternity demands perfection, not the lean cows. And yet perfection is fragile, which is why tombs are sealed with such care. Entrances concealed beneath rubble, curses etched above doorways, warning of divine retaliation, because grave robbers are as constant as the Nile, even in ancient times. Tomb robbery was common hunger and greed, pushing men to risk spiritual punishment for gold. And so, the obsession with protection grows. More traps, deeper corridors, heavier stone plugs, blocking passageways. Inside the palace, the pharaoh hears reports of thefts from older tombs, and perhaps unease flickers beneath his painted calm. Because if ancestors can be disturbed, what guarantees his own rest? This anxiety feeds further extravagance. Greater treasure buried, more spells inscribed, and the cycle continues. Wealth hidden in darkness rather than circulated in sunlight. Meanwhile, the Nile experiences an unusual season, waters receding too quickly, leaving fields thirsty, and cracked farmers kneeling to press dry soil between their fingers. Worry spreading through villages in low murmurs. In temple halls, priests intensify ceremonies, offerings stacked higher, incense smoke thick enough to sting the eyes, chants rising in urgent waves. And once again, the pharaoh's divine responsibility comes into question. To address unrest, the king may embark on a grand public display, traveling along the Nile in a ceremonial barge, banners fluttering, drums beating slowly, his figure radiant beneath a sunshade of embroidered linen projecting stability. Even if uncertainty coils inside him, such journeys reinforce presence, reminding distant communities that their ruler is near, visible, engaged with the river's fate. And perception often steadies fear more effectively than logic. Within the royal family, new tensions simmer as princes grow older, because brothers raised in sacred closeness begin to sense competition. Subtle shifts in how tutors address them, slight differences in ceremonial roles and ambition, stirs quietly like wind across desert sand. Royal mothers watch closely, calculating alliances within the court, encouraging certain friendships, discouraging others, knowing that succession will not be determined by affection alone. Incestuous marriages meant to unify divine blood can also intensify rivalry, because when siblings are also spouses, affection and ambition entangle in complicated ways. Loyalty tested not just by politics, but by personal betrayal. Imagine a queen who has shared childhood games with her brother later, shared a throne beside him, and now shares anxiety about which of their sons will inherit supreme power. And the weight of that possibility presses against every conversation they have. In quieter moments, she may walk through garden courtyards planted with sycamore trees, trailing fingers along rough bark, listening to distant temple bells, trying to separate genuine devotion from strategic necessity. The palace at night holds a different mood, torches flickering against carved reliefs corridors. Hushed, except for sandaled footsteps of guards and somewhere behind heavy doors, the pharaoh consults astrologers seeking reassurance from the stars themselves. Celestial alignment matters deeply in this world, because the sky mirrors the Nile's rhythm. Cycles reflecting cycles, and if a comet appears, or an eclipse darkens midday, interpretations swirl quickly. Astrologers might declare such events as warnings or blessings depending on need, because interpretation itself becomes a tool of stability, shaping fear into manageable narrative. And still the river flows, as it will. Sometimes generous, sometimes harsh, and each variation reinforces the fragile dance between divine claim and earthly reality. As years pass, the pharaoh's body begins to show signs of age, despite careful oils and cosmetic skill. Joints stiffening, eyesight dimming slightly in torchlight, and the urgency of afterlife preparation intensifies. He may spend longer hours reviewing tomb progress, inspecting carvings with critical gaze, ensuring that his name is spelled correctly in every cartouche, because a name preserved is a soul remembered. Erasure is the ultimate terror. Worse even than physical decay, which is why rival successors sometimes chisel out predecessors, names from monuments rewriting memory in stone, and this possibility lurks in the mind of every aging ruler. To guard against such humiliation, inscriptions multiply, statues erected across cities, colossal faces gazing over temple entrances, each one declaring presence so boldly that it would require enormous effort to erase. Back among common people, daily survival remains the true obsession. Nets cast into the Nile barley ground into bred children chasing goats along dusty paths, and while royal dramas unfold in marble halls, village life hinges simply on water and grain. Yet belief connects them, because when the river behaves unpredictably, both farmer and pharaoh feel the tremor, one in empty stomach, the other in shaken legitimacy, as the sun sets once more across golden sand, casting long shadows from temple pylons. Priests chant evening hymns to ensure safe passage of the sun through night's underworld, and in those hymns echoes the same hope that guides tomb paintings: continuity, rebirth, order restored by dawn. But dawn is never guaranteed. It is anticipated through ritual, defended through obsession, and in that constant defense, ancient Egypt reveals its deepest vulnerability, a civilization striving so fiercely to maintain balance that it risks bending under the strain. In lamplit chambers, the pharaoh finally lies down upon cushions embroidered with lotus petals, the scent of myrrh lingering in warm air. Eyes closing slowly as distant drums fade, and beneath layers of divine identity he is still a man listening to his own breath, aware that despite temples, despite marriages shaped by myth, despite curses carved into stone, the river will continue long after he is wrapped in linen and placed beneath desert rock. And that awareness, quiet and persistent, hums like the Nile at night, steady, unstoppable, indifferent to every obsession carved along its banks. As the rain stretches into its later years, the palace grows quieter in certain corridors, not because activity fades, but because anticipation replaces certainty. And anticipation has a different sound: softer footsteps, longer pauses before doors open, more guarded conversations drifting through painted halls. The pharaoh senses it too, even if no one dares to say it aloud, because age has a way of announcing itself in subtle aches. In the way servants offer an arm more quickly than before, in the extra cushion placed behind his back during long ceremonies, and so his obsession with immortality sharpens, not only in stone and gold, but in ritual intensity. Longer festivals dedicated to the gods, more elaborate processions along the Nile, sacred barges, polished until they gleam like sunlight captured in wood. The Opet festival, or others like it, become grand spectacles. Statues of gods carried from temple to temple while crowds kneel in dust, chanting praises. And at the center of it all, the pharaoh stands as living bridge between heaven and earth, reaffirming divine identity even as mortality inches closer. Incestuous unions within the royal house continue to be justified through sacred narrative. Yet, with each generation, the practical complications increase: rival branches of the family multiplying, cousins intertwined with siblings' claims to the throne, overlapping like tangled reeds along the riverbank. What was meant to preserve purity sometimes produces confusion, and confusion breeds suspicion. Because when too many children share nearly identical claims, choosing an heir becomes delicate and dangerous. Royal daughters, often married to their brothers, hold unusual symbolic power, titled as Great Royal Wife or God Issa, Wifi Foveman, their presence reinforcing legitimacy. And yet their personal lives remain shaped by obligation rather than freedom. Imagine one such queen walking through a colonnade at dusk, the sandstone glowing warm beneath fading light, her jewelry heavy against her collarbones, aware that her marriage secures cosmic order, yet privately wondering what life might feel like beyond ritual expectation. But such thoughts remain unspoken, because in this world, doubt itself can feel like betrayal of the gods. Meanwhile, the Nile delivers another unpredictable flood, not disastrous, not generous, simply uneven, nourishing some regions while leaving others anxious. And that unevenness mirrors the political landscape. Within the palace, stability in one wing, tension in another. Granaries are opened selectively, relief distributed where loyalty is strongest. And here the divine ruler reveals a human strategy, because generosity can be political as much as spiritual. In temple schools, scribes record harvest levels, carefully noting fluctuations year by year, and while official inscriptions emphasize harmony, private records hint at strain, at cycles that do not always align neatly with ritual promises. Back in the embalming houses, preparations intensify as the pharaoh's health declines. Special resins imported from distant lands, rare oils reserved for royal use, linen woven in vast quantities. Because when the moment comes, the transition from god-king to eternal god must be flawless. The high priests rehearse funerary rites in low voices, ensuring each chant flows seamlessly, each gesture precise, and even before death arrives, the machinery of mummification stands ready. There is something deeply human in this relentless preparation, a refusal to leave anything to chance, as though organization can conquer oblivion. Yet history has shown that even the most carefully sealed tomb can be breached. And perhaps somewhere in the Pharaoh's thoughts flickers the unsettling possibility that future generations may disturb his rest. Curses carved on tomb walls grow more elaborate over time, invoking crocodiles, serpents, divine wrath against intruders. Language designed to instill fear, and whether or not these curses possess supernatural force, they reveal profound anxiety about vulnerability after death. For a ruler who commands armies and labor forces in life, the idea of being defenseless in death is unbearable, and so words become weapons, etched in stone. Within the palace, succession discussions intensify behind closed doors, advisors weighing strengths of different princes' mothers, advocating subtly for their sons, and the air feels charged like the heavy stillness before a desert storm. Brothers who once played together now avoid prolonged eye contact, their conversations measured because each understands that affection cannot override destiny. Incestuous lineage meant to unify divine authority now sharpens rivalry, because every prince can claim purity of blood. Every prince carries sacred legitimacy, and that equality of claim becomes combustible. The pharaoh, aware of this tension, may attempt to designate a clear heir while still alive, elevating one son in ceremony, granting him visible responsibilities. Yet such designation does not erase ambition in others, it merely clarifies stakes outside palace walls. Ordinary Egyptians sense the shifting atmosphere through subtle cues, changes in tax collection, rumors carried along riverboats, priests speaking more frequently about continuity and stability. The Nile itself seems indifferent to human drama, gliding under moonlight, reflecting stars that have watched countless dynasties rise and fall. And that indifference is both comforting and unsettling, because while kings obsess over eternity, the river already embodies it, flowing beyond any single reign, beyond any carved monument. In private moments, the aging pharaoh might sit beside an open window, warm night air drifting in, listening to distant water lapping against docks, and perhaps for a fleeting second he feels small, not divine, not immortal, simply a man whose breath will one day stop. But such vulnerability cannot be displayed publicly. So at dawn he resumes regalia, crown balanced perfectly, false beard secured, eyes lined in kohl to project ageless authority, and ceremony continues. When death finally approaches, it does so quietly, perhaps after a lingering illness, perhaps suddenly, and the palace erupts into controlled chaos. Messengers dispatched, priests summoned, family members ushered into guarded chambers. The body is transferred swiftly to embalmers, rituals commencing almost immediately, because timing matters in preservation. And within hours, the transformation from living ruler to sacred corpse begins. Organs removed carefully, each placed into canopic jars under watchful supervision. The heart often left within the chest as seat of consciousness. The brain extracted and discarded, considered less essential. 40 days of drying pass in solemn rhythm, natron drawing moisture from flesh, attendants maintaining respectful silence, and after drying the wrapping begins. Hundreds of meters of linen wound around limbs and torso, amulets slipped between layers, each one inscribed with protective spells. Meanwhile, succession unfolds above ground. The chosen heir proclaimed, perhaps smoothly, perhaps amid quiet resistance, and the cycle resets. The funeral procession winds toward the tomb. Mourners wailing ritual laments, priests swinging censers that release thick clouds of incense. The sarcophagus carried with measured steps beneath the blazing sun. At the tomb entrance, final rites are performed, the opening of the mouth ceremony restoring senses to the deceased, so he may eat, speak and see in the afterlife. And then stone doors are sealed, darkness settling permanently inside, yet even as the tomb closes, life along the Nile continues uninterrupted. Fishermen casting nets at dawn, children splashing in shallows, farmers scanning the horizon for signs of next flood. The obsessions of one ruler dissolve into memory, replaced by those of the next. Incestuous unions arranged again, temples expanded further, curses carved anew, and through it all the river flows, patient, ancient, bearing witness without judgment. The tomb is sealed, now heavy stone pressed into place, corridors packed with rubble to confuse intruders, silence settling thick as desert dust. And yet even in that silence the story does not end, because obsession lingers long after breath is faded. Above ground, the new pharaoh ascends the throne, crowned beneath temple columns carved with lotus and papyrus. Priests declaring continuity, as if nothing fragile has occurred, as if death is merely a doorway neatly stepped through. But transitions are rarely seamless. And within palace chambers rival factions adjust quietly. Some relibed, some disappointed, some already calculating how to influence the new ruler. Is a priority. The previous king's incestuous unions become part of official memory, retold as sacred necessity, while any awkward truths are smoothed over in inscriptions. Because history here is not just recorded, it is curated. If the former pharaoh's lineage produced strong heirs, the narrative emphasizes divine blessing. If weakness or illness marked the bloodline, scribes redirect focus toward cosmic mystery rather than biological consequence. In temple reliefs, the new king appears as idealized youth, broad-shouldered, serene, untouched by the complexities that shaped his upbringing, and the cycle of image management begins again. Yet deep within the sealed tomb, the mummy rests, wrapped carefully. Amulets nestled between linen folds, spells guarding every limb, and the belief persists that disturbance would awaken consequences. Stories begin to circulate among workers and villagers about curses, about strange illnesses befalling those who trespass to near royal burial grounds. And whether these tales stem from coincidence or imagination matters less than their effect. They reinforce boundaries. The desert itself aids in this protection, heat baking the earth by day, cold settling sharply at night, winds erasing footprints within hours, as if nature collaborates in preserving secrecy. Generations pass and memories soften, but the monuments remain. Towering temples etched with scenes of gods embracing kings. Obelisks pointing skyward like frozen rays of sunlight. Pyramids anchoring the horizon with stubborn geometry. These structures reflect not only devotion but deep anxiety about him, because to carve one's name into stone is to argue with time. Meanwhile, the Nile continues its eternal rhythm. Floods, arriving with reassuring regularity some years, with unsettling variation in others, and each rise of water renews the same collective hope that balance will hold. Farmers still watch the river's edge carefully, marking levels against carved steps of Nile, calculating tax obligations based on predicted harvests, their lives entwined with cycles far older than any dynasty. Inside the palace, the new pharaoh may repeat familiar patterns, marrying a sister to secure divine image, commissioning additional chambers in ancestral tomb complexes, expanding temples to outshine predecessors. Obsession does not disappear. It evolves, shaped by precedent. Perhaps this ruler becomes particularly fixated on monumental expansion, driving laborers harder to construct statues even larger than before, believing that scale equals immortality. Or perhaps he leans more heavily into ritual purity, emphasizing divine marriage ceremonies with increased splendor, doubling down on symbolism to quiet, lingering doubts about lineage. And always beneath these choices flows the undercurrent of fear. Fear of famine, fear of rebellion, fear of being forgotten. If the Nile delivers poor floods in early years of a reign, anxiety intensifies, because legitimacy is still fresh and fragile, and priests may respond with amplified ceremony, calling upon Hapi with urgent voices. Public festivals grow grander in difficult times, not because resources are abundant, but because reassurance is necessary. Spectacle functioning as balm for uncertainty. In private quarters, royal couples continue the tradition of sacred union, their marriage framed as reenactment of divine myth, yet lived within human bodies susceptible to doubt, to exhaustion, to unspoken questions. Children born into this environment absorb expectation before they can walk, hearing constantly that their veins carry the blood of gods, that their destiny is intertwined with the Nile's pulse. Some will grow into confident rulers, others into anxious guardians of legacy, but all inherit the same web of obsession. Centuries later, when foreign powers conquer Egyptian lands, when new languages echo in temple courts, when old gods yield to new beliefs, the ancient tombs remain buried beneath sand, and curiosity begins to replace fear. Explorers in distant eras will step into chambers untouched for millennia, brushing dust from painted walls, marveling at preserved faces beneath gold masks. And the myth of mummy curses will flare anew. Sudden deaths of excavators, common illnesses, exaggerated by newspapers, narratives woven to match dramatic expectation. And once again the old anxiety surfaces, the sense that disturbing the dead invites consequence. But whether curse or coincidence, what persists most strongly is fascination, because the intensity with which ancient pharaohs guarded their afterlife reveals a universal human desire to matter beyond the span of a single lifetime. And here, along the Nile's banks, that desire manifested in incestuous unions meant to mirror gods, in mummification practices designed to defeat decay, in curses carved to defend stillness, and in constant monitoring of a river that symbolized both blessing and threat. As the sun sets once more over desert and water turning both gold for a brief shimmering moment, it becomes clear that the pharaohs' so-called perversions were intertwined with their worldview, extreme by modern measure, yet deeply logical within their own cosmic framework. They sought order in a landscape defined by cycles, sought permanence in a world shaped by change, sought divine continuity in fragile human flesh. The Nile flows on, regardless, reflecting stars that watched the first pyramids rise, and will watch them crumble slowly into sand. And in that endless flow lies the quiet reminder that obsession can build wonders, but it cannot halt time. The tombs remain, the curses echo in stories. The river continues its patient breathing, and the legacy of those ancient rulers endures, not because they conquered death, but because their fears and desires were carved so boldly into the earth that we still trace them with wondering eyes. End of topic.